The first warning is written not in stone, but in silence. Across the ancient Near East, cities once crowded with merchants and soldiers fall quiet. Palace gates collapse into dust. Archives end mid-record. Trade routes that had carried copper, timber, grain, and luxury goods for generations suddenly thin or disappear. Kingdoms rise, expand, and then fracture under pressures they can no longer absorb. Some are conquered, some are abandoned, some survive only as names preserved by their rivals. Yet along the Nile, political order returns again and again. Dynasties fail, capitals lose their authority, foreign rulers enter the country, and the state sometimes breaks apart for generations. Still, Egypt does not vanish. Its institutions are rebuilt, its symbols revived, and its rulers, whether native or foreign, almost always discover that governing Egypt means speaking in the language of Egypt's past. That endurance can create a misleading picture. Seen from a distance, 3,000 years of pharaohs can look like one continuous empire, calm and unbroken beneath the desert sun. It was nothing of the kind. Ancient Egypt was repeatedly divided, destabilized, and transformed. The centralized monarchy of the Old Kingdom weakened and gave way to regional powers. The Middle Kingdom rose from reunification, only to fragment again. The New Kingdom expanded into an empire and later lost much of what it had gained. The long history between roughly 3100 BCE and 30 BCE is not a straight line. It is a sequence of concentration and dispersal, confidence and crisis, collapse and restoration. The deeper mystery, then, is not why Egypt avoided collapse. It did not. The mystery is why collapse so often failed to become disappearance. To understand that distinction, it helps to stand at the edge of a ruined capital after the court has gone. The royal workshops are quieter. Officials who once drew authority from the palace now depend on local patrons. Monumental construction slows or stops. Grain shipments become less predictable. Rival families compete for influence. Yet beyond the palace walls, farmers still measure the seasons. Boatmen still move along the river. Temples retain land, personnel, and ritual responsibilities. Provincial elites continue to manage estates and organize labor. Scribes still know how to record obligations. Craftspeople still transmit techniques. The political center may be shrinking, but society is not emptying itself of memory. This is one of the most important corrections offered by modern research into ancient collapse. Archaeologists increasingly avoid treating collapse as a single moment, when an entire civilization suddenly ceases to exist. What disappears first is often a particular scale of organization, a royal court, a palace economy, an imperial network, or a ruling dynasty. Beneath that level, other forms of life continue. They may reorganize around towns, temples, kinship groups, or regional leaders, but they do not necessarily lose every institution that once connected them to the larger state. In Egypt, those surviving layers became the material from which later rulers could rebuild. The end of the Old Kingdom offers a powerful example. For centuries, the royal state had commanded resources on an extraordinary scale. It supported court officials, mortuary foundations, expedition networks, and monument building whose remains still dominate the Egyptian landscape. But by the late 3rd millennium BCE, central authority weakened. The causes remain debated: changing Nile floods, episodes of aridity, political succession, the growing independence of provincial elites, and the burdens of maintaining a large administrative and ritual system may all have contributed. No single explanation fully accounts for the transformation, and the evidence remains uneven across regions. What is clear is that royal power contracted sharply. Older historical narratives often described what followed as darkness, famine, disorder, and cultural decline. Some ancient Egyptian texts, written later and shaped by political memory, encourage that image by presenting division as a world overturned. Yet excavations outside the old royal centre reveal a more complicated picture. Provincial communities did not simply wait for Memphis to revive. Local elites built tombs, supported cults, sponsored craftsmen, and developed their own claims to legitimacy. Networks that had once depended heavily on the court became more regional. Traditions continued, but they were adapted to new circumstances. When reunification eventually came, the emerging Middle Kingdom did not create order from nothing. It drew upon institutions, families, religious practices, and administrative habits that had survived the breakdown. This pattern would repeat in different forms. Egypt's political unity could fracture because its governing system was never as simple as one absolute ruler issuing commands to a passive country. Pharaoh stood at the symbolic summit, but power moved through many layers: administrators, temple estates, provincial officials, military households, land-holding families, village authorities, and personal networks of obligation. These relationships could create corruption, rivalry, and fragmentation. They could also provide redundancy. When one level failed, others remained capable of organizing production and preserving social order. That does not mean ordinary life continued unchanged. Political breakdown could bring real hardship. Distribution networks weakened, local conflicts intensified, communities faced uncertain floods, changing taxation, and reduced security. Long-distance trade could contract. Survival was not effortless, and resilience should not be romanticized. It often meant improvising with fewer resources and transferring loyalty from distant institutions to local ones. Egypt endured partly because people below the level of kingship knew how to continue without waiting for the state to become whole again. The contrast with neighbouring powers is therefore not a simple story of Egyptian strength against foreign weakness. The Hittite Empire, the Mycenaean palace states, and other societies of the eastern Mediterranean occupied different landscapes and depended on different political and economic arrangements. Some were more exposed to disruptions in the international trade. Some relied heavily on palace centres that coordinated specialised production. Some faced invasions, internal conflict, migration, environmental stress, or cascading failures across several systems at once. Scholars still debate the weight of each cause. What matters is that a shock becomes most dangerous when it spreads through food, transport, legitimacy, defense, administration, and exchange, leaving few functioning structures from which recovery can begin. Egypt was vulnerable to the same kinds of pressure, but its losses were often uneven. It could lose influence abroad while retaining its river valley. It could lose a dynasty while preserving temples and local administrations. It could lose a capital while other cities remained productive. It could absorb foreign rulers without forcing the population to abandon the religious and political vocabulary through which authority was understood. In that sense, Egypt's longevity came from an ability to fail in pieces. The landscape encouraged this pattern, but geography alone cannot explain it. The Nile concentrated population, food production, transport, and political attention within a narrow corridor. That made the country easier to reconnect after division. Yet the river also shifted. Floods varied, channels silted, and regions experienced environmental change differently. Egypt survived not because nature guaranteed stability, but because generations learned to manage instability within a landscape that repeatedly drew them back into contact. Before we go deeper, take a moment to like the video and subscribe if this is the kind of history and mystery you enjoy. Because the real story of Egypt's endurance begins not with invincibility, but with reconstruction. Again and again, rulers claimed that disorder had been defeated and balance restored. Again and again, they looked backward for models of legitimacy. The monuments made that restoration appear eternal. But beneath the stone was something more practical: communities that kept producing, officials who kept recording, institutions that could be adapted, and a cultural memory strong enough to make reunification imaginable. Egypt lasted because its people did not need an unbroken state in order to remain Egyptian. When the palace fell silent, too much still survived outside it. That survival outside the palace begins with the river, but not in the simple way later imagination often presents it. The Nile did not make Egypt immortal, and it did not rise with perfect regularity like a machine designed for kings. It shifted, failed, flooded unevenly, changed course, buried harbours in silt, stranded settlements, and favoured one region while disappointing another. Yet compared with the harsher uncertainty faced by many neighbouring societies, it offered something extraordinarily valuable, a recurring framework around which food, movement, taxation, ritual, and political power could be organised. Each year, waters arriving from far beyond Egypt spread across the valley and delta, laying down moisture and sediment before retreating. The flood did not need to be understood in modern hydrological terms to shape every level of life. Farmers watched its timing, height, and reach. Officials measured fields after boundaries were blurred. Communities repaired embankments, cleared channels, and adjusted planting. Boats moved where roads would have been slower and more costly. Grain from productive districts could be carried toward towns, temples, garrisons, and royal centres. The river was not merely a source of water, it was Egypt's central transport route, agricultural calendar, and political spine. This concentration mattered enormously. In many ancient landscapes, populations were scattered across broad plains, separated by mountains, forests, or long overland routes. Egypt's settled core formed a narrow ribbon. In Upper Egypt, villages and towns stood close to the river, because beyond the cultivated land the desert began abruptly. In the delta, the landscape opened into branching channels and wetlands, but it still belonged to the same river system. A ruler seeking to reunify the country did not have to rebuild control over an unlimited expanse. Authority could move along a corridor already used by grain boats, officials, pilgrims, traders, and military expeditions. The effect was not automatic unity. The Nile Valley could still fracture into competing regions, and the delta's shifting channels made communication more complicated than a map suggests. But the geography made political reconnection unusually practical. When central authority weakened, local centres often remained linked by the same river that had served the royal state. When a new dynasty attempted reunification, it could extend influence northward or southward through routes already embedded in daily life. The river reduced the cost of rebuilding scale. The annual flood also created a form of predictability without guaranteeing abundance. A flood that was too low could leave insufficient land watered. One that arose too high could damage settlements, storage areas, and irrigation works. A sequence of poor years could strain even a strong administration. Scholars still debate the degree to which climatic changes contributed to major political breakdowns. including the end of the Old Kingdom. The evidence remains incomplete, and conditions were not identical across the entire country. Some districts may have suffered severe agricultural stress while others remained more productive. What survives in the record suggests not one national experience, but a patchwork of local outcomes. That variation helps explain why Egypt could bend without always breaking. If hardship did not strike every region equally, grain, labour, or livestock could sometimes be redirected. Temples, estates, and provincial authorities might hold stores when the royal centre was weak. Households adjusted crops, movement, and exchange. Communities in desert margins opened or abandoned routes depending on access to water and political security. The resilience of the Nile system lay partly in the fact that it was not a single field dependent on a single harvest. It was a long chain of environments connected by water. Storage turned seasonal abundance into political endurance. Grain harvested after a favourable flood could be dried, measured, stored, taxed, redistributed, and used as payment. In an economy where coined money arrived very late, grain was one of the most practical forms of wealth. It fed workers, supported temples, provisioned expeditions, and sustained officials. A granary was therefore more than a warehouse. It was a bridge between years. It allowed surplus gathered in one season to become labour, security, or relief in another. The scale of royal control should not be exaggerated. No pharaoh personally commanded every field, and the state did not necessarily own or count every grain of wheat. Production involved households, temples, estates, local elites, and institutions whose interests sometimes overlapped and sometimes competed. Yet writing and measurement allowed rulers to make agricultural wealth visible in a way that pastoral or dispersed economies often resisted. Fields could be assessed, deliveries could be recorded, workers could receive rations, obligations could be attached to land and offices. The Nile's fertility became politically useful because administrators learned how to translate crops into lists, quotas, and stored goods. This was one of Egypt's quiet advantages during crisis. A society that can record obligations, identify productive districts, and move supplies along a navigable river has more options when conditions worsen. Those options do not prevent famine or injustice. Records can be falsified, officials can hoard, taxes can deepen suffering. Powerful institutions may protect themselves before protecting vulnerable households. Resilience at the level of civilization is not always comfort at the level of the individual. Sometimes the same machinery that preserves the state makes life harder for the people sustaining it. Even so, the combination of river transport and agricultural surplus created a durable base from which political systems could return. Egypt did not depend entirely on imported food or a single foreign trade network. Cedar from Lebanon, copper from Sinai and beyond, incense from the south, silver, luxury goods, and specialized materials all mattered, especially to royal and temple economies. But the central calories of the population came from the Nile Valley itself. When international exchange contracted, Egypt could become poorer, less powerful, and less capable of projecting force abroad without immediately losing the agricultural heart of the country. This distinction becomes especially important during the disruptions at the end of the Late Bronze Age. Palaces across the eastern Mediterranean were tied into complex systems of diplomacy, shipping, tribute, and elite exchange. When multiple links failed at once, some centers lost access to materials, authority, and specialized production on which their political order depended. Egypt also suffered. It faced military pressure, economic strain, internal disorder, and the gradual loss of imperial reach. Yet its core was not a palace sitting at the end of a long supply chain. It was a populated river valley capable of feeding large communities even after the outer network contracted. The Nile also supported continuity in ritual and memory. Flooding was not merely agricultural. It was woven into ideas of renewal, kingship, fertility, and cosmic balance. The river's return offered a visible model of restoration after apparent death. Silt covered the fields, waters withdrew, and green growth emerged again from dark earth. Egyptian political language drew power from this rhythm. A king who restored order could be imagined as doing on the human level what the river and the gods did in the natural world. That symbolism mattered because recovery requires more than food. It requires a believable story about why authority should return. The Nile gave Egypt both material resources and a recurring image of renewal. Yet the image worked only because people maintained dikes, fields, boats, storage systems, records, and local relationships. The river brought possibilities, not guarantees. Its deepest gift was therefore not perfect abundance, but concentration. It gathered population into a connected corridor, linked fertile districts by water, and made the reconstruction of authority easier after fragmentation. Empires around Egypt could lose their capitals and their networks at the same time. Egypt could lose its court and still retain the line of settlements from which another court might rise. The river did not prevent the country from falling apart. It made it possible for the pieces to find one another again. The pieces could find one another because Egypt was not only a river valley, it was a river valley enclosed by difficult space. To the west stretched the Libyan desert, broken by oases but hostile to large armies without careful preparation. To the east lay the eastern desert and the Red Sea hills, crossed by routes to quarries, mines, and ports, yet still demanding in water and logistics. To the south, the Nile narrowed through cataract zones that slowed movement. To the north, the delta opened toward the Mediterranean and Sinai, but access was funneled through marshes, channels, forts, and a limited number of approaches. Egypt was not sealed from the world, but it was difficult to enter in strength. This mattered because political endurance often depends on how much damage an enemy can do after winning a battle. A kingdom with broad open frontiers may lose not only an army, but also its farmland, roads, cities, and administrative centres in rapid succession. Egypt's cultivated core was narrow, concentrated, and shielded by terrain that made sustained conquest expensive. Invaders could cross the frontier, and several did. But reaching Egypt was not the same as controlling the entire Nile Valley, and controlling the valley was not the same as erasing the institutions that made Egypt function. The deserts were never empty. Egyptian expeditions moved through them in search of stone, copper, gold, and trade. Officials marked routes, dug wells, established stations, and connected the valley to oases and distant regions. Caravans carried goods between the Nile and the Red Sea. The same landscape that hindered invasion could be opened selectively by people who knew its paths. Routes expanded when the state was strong and contracted when water, security, or demand declined. What survives in the record suggests a flexible geography rather than a fixed defensive wall. This flexibility is easy to miss because deserts appear permanent from a distance. In reality, their usefulness changed with climate, technology, political control, and access to water. A route that supported trade in one century might become dangerous in another. A well could determine whether an expedition succeeded. An oasis could become a refuge, a trading centre, or a frontier zone. Scholars still debate the scale of some desert networks, but the larger pattern is clear: Egyptians repeatedly adjusted how they moved through marginal environments. That ability strengthened the Nile heartland. During periods of central power, the state could reach outward for resources without shifting the population away from the river. During periods of weakness, activity could retreat toward the valley, where agriculture and dense settlement remained concentrated. Egypt could lose access to distant mines or overseas trade and still preserve its demographic core. The outer layers could shrink while the center continued. The cataracts to the south offered a different kind of protection. They were not impassable barriers, but they disrupted navigation and created points where movement could be watched or resisted. Egypt's relationship with Nubia changed repeatedly. At times, Egyptian rulers built forts, occupied territory, controlled trade, and drew wealth from gold. At other times, Nubian powers expanded northward, and rulers from Kush eventually governed Egypt itself. The frontier moved because neither geography nor military strength guaranteed permanent control. Yet large-scale movement through the cataract region required planning, river knowledge, and secure bases. To the northeast, the situation was more dangerous. Sinai connected Egypt to southwest Asia, and the eastern delta became the country's most exposed zone. Traders, migrants, soldiers, and invading armies passed through this region over millennia. It was also one of Egypt's most productive and cosmopolitan areas. Settlements such as Tel el-Daba show that foreign communities could become deeply embedded in local life long before political power changed hands. The frontier was not simply a military line. It was a place where identities mixed, technologies moved, and alliances formed. This openness eventually contributed to the rise of the Hyksos, rulers of Western Asian origin who controlled much of northern Egypt during the Second Intermediate Period. Older accounts often frame their arrival as a sudden invasion that shattered an isolated Egyptian world. Archaeology presents a more gradual process. Communities from Southwest Asia had lived in the eastern delta for generations. Trade, family networks, and local power likely mattered alongside conflict. By the time Hyksos rulers held authority at Avaris, they were not governing a landscape entirely alien to them. Their rule demonstrates both Egypt's vulnerability and its resilience. The north could be controlled by a foreign dynasty. The south remained under Theban rulers who preserved their institutions and eventually launched campaigns of reunification. Egypt's geography allowed division, but it also limited the reach of any single regional centre. The long river created distance between north and south, while still offering a route along which power could later expand. The sea offered no absolute safety either. Mediterranean networks brought timber, metals, pottery, ideas, and diplomacy. Coastal access exposed the delta to raiding and migration. During the crisis around 1200 BCE, Egyptian inscriptions describe conflicts with groups remembered under the broad modern label of the Sea Peoples. The details remain contested. These were not necessarily one united invading nation, and the sources are royal monuments designed to celebrate victory. Yet they show that Egypt faced serious pressure when other eastern Mediterranean states were collapsing. Egypt survived those attacks, but survival came at a cost. Military victories did not preserve the old imperial system. The state lost influence abroad. Trade patterns shifted, and internal economic problems deepened. Natural defences slowed and channeled danger. They did not eliminate it. A protected core could still be weakened from within by succession disputes, fiscal strain, poor floods, or rivalry among powerful institutions. This is why geography must be treated as an advantage rather than a destiny. The deserts did not govern Egypt. The cataracts did not write tax records. The sea did not organize food storage. Terrain gave Egyptian states time, distance, and strategic depth. But people had to convert those advantages into forts, routes, patrols, negotiations, and local knowledge. When those systems failed, the frontiers opened. When they recovered, the same landscape once again became defensible. There was also a psychological dimension to enclosure. The cultivated valley, with its dark soil and green fields, stood in sharp contrast to the pale deserts beyond. Egyptians often imagined their land as an ordered centre, surrounded by dangerous or unfamiliar spaces. That contrast helped strengthen the idea that Egypt was a coherent world, a place whose unity was natural even when politics said otherwise. Such ideas were never perfect descriptions of reality. Egypt was culturally diverse: Nubians, Libyans, people from Southwest Asia, and many others lived within its boundaries and served its rulers. Frontiers shifted. Foreign dynasties adopted Egyptian titles and rituals. Yet the image of the two lands as one ordered realm proved remarkably durable. Geography made that image plausible. The valley looked connected, bounded, and distinct. When the central state weakened, local rulers could still claim authority over part of that familiar landscape. When reunifiers rose, they did not need to invent a new political map. They could promise to restore the land that already existed in memory, ritual, and geography. The deserts gave Egypt protection, but their greater gift may have been definition. They made the Nile corridor feel like a world with edges. That world could be invaded, divided, and ruled by outsiders, but it was difficult to dissolve. Long before Egypt became a kingdom of pyramids, temples, and royal names carved into stone, the Nile Valley was a chain of communities with their own leaders, burial grounds, exchange networks, and local identities. Villages clustered along productive land. Regional centres grew around trade, ritual, and control of nearby resources. Pottery styles, burial customs, and elite objects reveal increasing contact between North and South. But they also show that early Egypt was not born fully formed. Unification was a process, not a single dramatic moment. By the late 4th millennium BCE, powerful centres in Upper Egypt were expanding their influence. Places such as Abydos, Nakada, and Hierakonpolis became important nodes in competition, trade, and political display. Elites gathered exotic goods from Nubia, the Levant, and distant regions. They commissioned decorated objects, enlarged tombs, and used images of rulers, captives, standards, and ceremonial violence to communicate authority. These were not yet the monumental pharaohs of later centuries, but the language of kingship was already taking shape. The traditional beginning of dynastic Egypt is often placed around 3100 BCE, when Upper and Lower Egypt were brought under one ruler. Later king lists associated this achievement with a figure called Menes, while archaeological evidence points to rulers such as Narmer and perhaps his immediate predecessors and successors. The exact identity of the first unifier remains debated, and the process may have stretched across several reigns. What survives suggests consolidation through a mixture of warfare, marriage, administration, trade, ritual, and the gradual absorption of rival centres. One of the most famous objects from this period, the Narmer palette, captures the political imagination of unification. It shows a ruler wearing the crown associated with Upper Egypt on one side and the crown associated with Lower Egypt on the other. The image is ceremonial rather than a literal battlefield report, and scholars still debate how directly it records historical events. Yet its message is unmistakable. One ruler claims authority over both regions, and that claim is presented as a cosmic and political achievement. The idea of the two lands became one of the most durable concepts in Egyptian history. Egypt could be spoken of as north and south, delta and valley, two distinct regions joined under a single crown. The ruler was not merely king of a territory. He was the one who held opposites together. Royal titles, regalia, temple rituals, and official art repeated this image for millennia, even when the country was divided in practice. The ideal of unity remained available as a standard against which disorder could be judged. This mattered because political systems survive longer when they preserve not only institutions, but also a clear image of what restoration should look like. In many fractured landscapes, competing rulers may create entirely new states with different borders and identities. In Egypt, ambitious leaders repeatedly claimed that they were restoring the rightful unity of the two lands. The old map remained emotionally and ritually powerful. A reunifier did not need to persuade people that a new political world should exist. He could claim that the ancient order had been repaired. The double crown condensed that argument into a single image. It was a visual statement that North and South belonged together, even if governing them required compromise or force and constant negotiation. The symbolism was simple, the reality was not. The delta differed from the narrow valley in agriculture, settlement pattern, communication, and exposure to foreign contact. Provincial elites held their own power. Local cults and traditions remained important. Unification did not erase regional diversity. It created a political framework broad enough to contain it. The early states strengthened that framework through administration. Royal authority became visible in seals, labels, tomb goods, standardized measures, and systems of collection and distribution. Goods moved toward royal and ceremonial centers. Officials acted in the king's name. Writing developed in close connection with the need to identify places, people, commodities, and institutions. The earliest texts are often brief, but their very existence reveals a new scale of organization. A kingdom that stretched from the delta to southern Egypt required memory beyond the spoken word. This administrative expansion helped transform conquest into durability. Winning territory is one thing, making it legible is another. Fields, storehouses, estates, labor groups, and transport routes had to be connected to a ruling center. The state did not achieve perfect control, and much of early administration remains obscure. But the ability to record and classify resources gave rulers a practical means of turning symbolic unity into repeated action. Royal burial also played a role. Early dynastic kings were buried at Abydos, while administrative and political activity increasingly focused near Memphis, close to the meeting point of Valley and Delta. That location was strategically powerful. It allowed rulers to oversee movement between Upper and Lower Egypt, and to position the court near the hinge of the two lands. Memphis would remain one of Egypt's most important political and religious centers for centuries, even when other capitals rose elsewhere. The choice reveals how geography and ideology reinforced each other. The state placed itself where north and south could be joined materially. While royal ritual declared that the joining was sacred, this combination helped make unity seem older, deeper, and more necessary than any individual dynasty. A king might fail. The principle of kingship remained. Yet early unification was not peaceful in the modern sense. Royal imagery celebrates domination and the defeat of enemies. Political expansion likely displaced or subordinated rival elites. The evidence is incomplete, and it does not permit a simple reconstruction of one final war. Still, the birth of the Egyptian state involved coercion as well as cooperation. Stability was built through control, and the official image of harmony concealed the struggles required to produce it. That tension would continue throughout Egyptian history. The state presented unity as natural and timeless, while rulers worked constantly to maintain it. Taxes had to be collected, local officials had to be rewarded or restrained, frontiers had to be defended, temples had to be supported, grain had to move, succession had to be secured. The double crown was less a description of permanent reality than a promise that reality could be brought back into alignment. This promise became especially important during times of division. When the Old Kingdom weakened, regional powers did not invent wholly separate civilizations. When Theban rulers later reunified Egypt, they framed their victory as restoration. The same pattern appeared after the Hyksos period, and in later centuries under rulers of different origins. Even foreign dynasties often adopted the titles, crowns, and rituals of Egyptian kingship because these forms made authority recognizable. The unification of Egypt therefore created more than the first large territorial state along the Nile. It created a political memory that survived the failure of many governments. The two lands could be separated, but their separation was described as a wound. Reunification could be presented as healing. That idea gave future rulers a ready-made language of legitimacy and gave society a durable expectation that fragmentation was temporary. Egypt's longevity began here, in the moment when unity became not merely an achievement, but an obligation. Once North and South had been imagined as parts of one ordered world, every later collapse carried within it the possibility of return. The obligation to reunite Egypt rested on more than military ambition. It was supported by a larger idea about how the world itself was supposed to function. Egyptians expressed that idea through the concept of me'at order, balance, justice, rightness, truth, and proper relationship. No single English word fully captures it. Ma'at was not merely a moral principle or a religious symbol. It was the condition that allowed the sun to rise, the river to return, the gods to receive offerings, communities to remain stable, and kingship to appear legitimate. Its opposite was disorder, often imagined as violence, falsehood, hunger, rebellion, foreign threat, or the breakdown of proper boundaries. The contrast was never absolute in daily life. Egyptian society contained conflict, inequality, corruption, and uncertainty like any other. Yet official culture repeatedly insisted that order could be restored and maintained. This belief gave Egyptian political life a powerful resilience. A state could fail without destroying the idea of the state, because the ideal it claimed to serve was older than any dynasty. The king stood at the center of this system. He was expected to uphold Ma'at before the gods and among human beings. Temple scenes show rulers presenting offerings, defeating enemies, receiving life from deities, and maintaining cosmic balance. These images are highly formalized and should not be read as straightforward records of what each king personally did. A pharaoh could not be present in every temple, inspect every canal, or judge every dispute. His role was symbolic and institutional. He embodied the claim that Egypt remained connected to divine order. This symbolic function had practical consequences. Officials acted in the king's name. Temples performed rituals for the stability of the land. Taxes, labor, and agricultural production could be framed as contributions to a system that sustained both society and the gods. Royal building projects created visible statements of permanence. Inscriptions announced that temples had been restored, enemies defeated, neglected cults revived, and justice returned. Even rulers who seized power under uncertain circumstances often described themselves not as innovators, but as restorers. That language was especially effective after crisis. A new dynasty did not have to admit that it was constructing a different Egypt. It could claim that Egypt had temporarily fallen out of balance and was now being brought back into alignment. Political change became restoration rather than rupture. The past provided a standard, and the ruler presented himself as the one capable of meeting it. This helped explain why Egyptian institutions could survive conquest. Foreign rulers who wished to govern effectively often adopted Egyptian titulary, temple rituals, artistic conventions, and ideas of kingship. They did not always do so out of simple admiration. Egyptian religious institutions controlled land, labor, wealth, and local legitimacy. To rule Egypt while ignoring them would have been difficult. By presenting themselves as defenders of Ma'at, outsiders could enter an established political language that communities already understood. The endurance of that language is striking. Libyan rulers, Nubian kings, Persian emperors, Macedonian monarchs, and Ptolemaic pharaohs all engaged with Egyptian forms of sacred kingship to varying degrees. Their power did not erase every older institution. In many cases, it depended on those institutions. A conqueror might change the ruling family, military hierarchy, or external alliances while leaving temples, priesthoods, administrative practices, and local identities largely intact. This did not mean religion froze Egypt in place. Beliefs changed over time. Gods rose or declined in prominence. Theologies developed, capitals shifted, and with them the political importance of particular cults. Amun's rise under the New Kingdom looked different from the religious world of the Old Kingdom. Osiris became increasingly central to ideas of death and regeneration. Solar traditions changed and combined with other forms of worship. Scholars still debate how much ordinary people shared the formal theological systems recorded in elite monuments. The surviving evidence is heavily shaped by temples, tombs, and literate institutions. Even so, religion provided a common structure through which change could be absorbed. A new god did not always require the rejection of older ones. Egyptian thought often allowed deities to merge, overlap, or express related aspects of divine power. The system could expand without demanding total replacement. This flexibility reduced the likelihood that political or cultural change would destroy the entire sacred framework. Temples were central to that continuity. They were houses of the gods, but they were also economic and administrative institutions. They owned land, employed workers, stored goods, managed estates, trained scribes, supported craftsmen, and maintained ritual calendars. Some became enormously wealthy and politically influential. Their power could rival the crown, especially when royal authority weakened. This tension sometimes contributed to fragmentation, yet it also meant that resources and organization existed outside the palace. When a dynasty collapsed, temples did not necessarily disappear with it. Their estates, personnel, local ties, and rituals could continue. Priests preserved texts, titles, and traditions. Workshops maintained artistic conventions. Communities remained attached to local cults. These institutions could therefore outlast rulers and provide continuity during political uncertainty. Their role should not be idealized. Temple wealth could be concentrated in elite hands. Religious authority could reinforce hierarchy. Rival priesthoods competed for influence. Royal gifts to temples could reduce resources available elsewhere. During some periods, the growth of temple estates weakened the fiscal base of the monarchy. The same institution that preserved continuity could also contribute to the erosion of central power. This is a recurring feature of Egyptian resilient structures that stabilized society could become sources of division. Provincial elites protected local life but challenged kings. Temples preserved ritual and administration, but accumulated independent wealth. Military commanders defended the state but could become kingmakers. The system endured not because its parts remained obedient, but because those parts retained enough capacity to keep functioning when the center faltered. Matt helped contain these tensions by giving competing powers a shared vocabulary. A provincial ruler could claim to defend order. A conquering dynasty could present itself as legitimate restoration. A temple could portray its wealth as service to the gods. A king could frame taxation and labor as necessary for balance. These claims were political, but they were also culturally persuasive because they connected immediate authority to a cosmic pattern. The annual rituals of kingship reinforced that pattern. Festivals renewed royal power, linked rulers to gods, and gathered communities around established forms. Processions moved divine images beyond temple walls. Coronation rites placed new kings within traditions that seemed to stretch back to the beginning of time. Said festivals symbolically renewed the ruler's strength, even when the historical reality of succession was violent or uncertain. Ritual transformed instability into continuity. Written tradition deepened the effect. Instructions, hymns, royal inscriptions, funerary texts, and literary works carried ideals across generations. Later rulers could copy older language and revive archaic styles to connect themselves with admired periods. The past remained available as a political resource because it had been preserved in monuments, archives, and education. That preservation created something close to institutional memory. Egypt could remember earlier models of order. When one political arrangement failed, the society did not have to imagine legitimacy from nothing. It could return to familiar titles, ceremonies, gods, and symbols. The result was not exact repetition. Each restoration changed what it inherited, but continuity was made believable because the language of restoration was so old and so widely recognized. The sacred state survived. Then, not because every ruler was respected or every institution remained strong, it survived because kingship was embedded in a larger vision of the world. Dynasties could be judged as failures without discrediting the idea that Egypt required ordered rule. Foreigners could be condemned in one era and accepted in another if they adopted the proper forms. Division could be described as temporary because unity was imagined as the natural condition of the two lands. Stone monuments gave this system its most imposing face, but the deeper strength lay in repetition. Day after day, offerings were made, titles were copied, festivals returned, officials invoked justice, kings announced restoration. The same language passed through centuries of political change. Egyptian rulers did not merely govern a territory. They inherited a role in a cosmic drama whose script had been written long before them. That script could survive the death of the actors. The script that outlived kings was written not only on temple walls, but on labels, accounts, delivery lists, legal documents, tax records, seals, letters, and scraps used by people whose names rarely entered royal history. Sacred language gave Egyptian power its claim to permanence. Administration gave that claim a daily routine. Writing appeared in Egypt before the Great Pyramids and before the state had reached its mature form. Some of the earliest signs and labels were tied to the movement, identification, and storage of goods. A mark could connect a container to a place, an estate, an official, or a ruler. It could turn an object into part of a system. Memory no longer depended entirely on the person who had counted, witnessed, or delivered something. Hieroglyphs became the most visible form of Egyptian writing, carved and painted in monuments with a beauty later generations would treat as the civilization's signature. Yet much of Egypt was administered through faster scripts, especially hieratic and, in later periods, demotic. These were working tools. They allowed scribes to keep accounts, copy letters, record court cases, issue receipts, document land transfers, calculate rations, and follow the movement of labor and grain. Monumental inscriptions declared what order should look like. Administrative writing tracked whether anything had actually arrived. Egypt's long survival depended less on the existence of impressive texts than on the repeated use of writing to make people, land, and resources legible. A field could be measured, a shipment could be assigned, a worker could appear on a roster, a temple estate could record income, a tax obligation could be linked to a community, a court decision could preserve a claim after the witnesses were gone. None of these records created perfect control, and scholars still debate how consistently different levels of administration communicated. But writing expanded the reach of institutions beyond face-to-face authority. Scribes stood at the center of this world. Their training required years of practice, familiarity with language, numeracy, document forms, and official conventions. They were not a single uniform class. Some served royal departments, others worked for temples, estates, military units, workshops, local administrations, or private households. Their positions ranged from modest record keepers to powerful officials whose families occupied high offices across generations. Literacy was limited, and most Egyptians interacted with writing through people who could produce or interpret documents for them. That limitation made scribes influential. They translated the complexity of fields, harvests, labor, disputes, and deliveries into categories the state or institution could use. A missing entry could hide a shortage. A carefully worded petition could reshape a legal claim. An account could protect property or expose failure. Administration was not a neutral machine. It was made of people with loyalties, ambitions, families, and opportunities for corruption. Egyptian records reveal anxiety about dishonest officials, inaccurate measures, unpaid rations, and the misuse of office. Instructions praise the fair administrator, partly because unfair ones were familiar. Satirical texts celebrate the scribal profession, while mocking other forms of labour. But these works are literary and self-serving. What survives suggests a bureaucracy that was skilled, adaptive, and imperfect. Its imperfections did not cancel its value. A system does not need to function flawlessly to become durable. It needs to preserve enough information, repeat enough procedures, and train enough replacements that work can continue after individuals disappear. Egyptian administration did this across extraordinary spans of time. Offices changed names, departments expanded or contracted, capitals moved, temple institutions gained or lost influence. Foreign rulers introduced new practices, yet the habit of governing through records remained. Taxation made that habit visible. Agricultural wealth was not available to the state until it could be assessed, claimed, collected, and transported. Officials surveyed land, estimated production, registered property, and recorded deliveries. The exact methods varied by period, and the evidence is uneven. It would be an exaggeration to imagine a perfectly centralized annual census covering every household in the same way for 3,000 years. Local arrangements, exemptions, temple privileges, and the influence of powerful families complicated the picture. Still, large institutions could convert part of the harvest into stored and redistributed resources. Grain-supported palace personnel, craftsmen, soldiers, expeditions, temple workers, and labour crews. It could be issued as rations or wages, textiles, oil, livestock, and other goods also moved through systems of obligation and payment. The economy was not simply a royal command structure, but record-keeping allowed rulers and institutions to coordinate resources on a scale no village memory could sustain alone. This capacity was especially important for large projects. Monument building required more than labour. Workers had to be gathered, organised, housed, supplied, and assigned. Tools and materials had to arrive in sequence. Quarrying teams, boat crews, craftsmen, overseers, and food producers had to remain connected. Surviving records show that Egyptian projects depended on careful provisioning as much as on royal ambition. Stone could express eternity only because someone recorded bread, beer, tools, absences, and deliveries. A lesser-known strength of this system was its ability to preserve responsibility. Seals and seal impressions tied containers, storerooms, or documents to offices and institutions. Titles identified chains of authority. Letters carried instructions between distant officials. Archives accumulated evidence of decisions. These practices did not eliminate theft or fraud, but they created a world in which actions could leave administrative traces. Those traces helped power survive a change of ruler. A new king did not inherit only temples and fields. He inherited categories, offices, trained personnel, document traditions, and expectations about how resources should be managed. Even a conquering dynasty could use much of what already existed. Officials might be replaced at the top, while lower levels continued to measure, write, store, and distribute. The machinery of rule could be adapted faster than it could be invented. This was one reason foreign control did not always produce cultural erasure. A conqueror might command the army, but governing the harvest required people who understood where the fields were, which estates claimed privileges, how transport worked, and which records carried authority. Practical dependence encouraged continuity. Administration also strengthened recovery after internal collapse. When the royal centre weakened, local institutions often retained their own scribes and records. Provincial elites managed estates. Temples preserved accounts. Families transmitted office-holding traditions. The surviving system became more regional, but it did not become administratively blank. When a new central power emerged, it could reconnect structures that had never completely stopped functioning. The Middle Kingdom's restoration illustrates this process. Reunification did not revive the Old Kingdom exactly as it had been. The new state reorganized provincial relationships, reshaped offices, and developed its own political language. Yet it drew on older administrative habits and on local networks that had survived division. The state returned because memory had remained distributed. Writing also preserved precedent. Legal formulas, literary models, titles, and ritual texts could be copied and adapted. Later generations sometimes wrote in archaic styles to claim connection with admired ages. The written past became a reservoir of authority. Egypt's institutions could change while presenting change as continuity. Papyrus decayed, archives burned, were discarded, or disappeared. Most records are lost, and the evidence remains incomplete. Yet even the surviving fraction reveals a society deeply accustomed to governing through documents. The endurance of Egypt was therefore not only carved into pyramids or embodied in divine kingship, it was filed, counted, sealed, copied, and recalculated. Dynasties could claim eternity because generations of administrators repeatedly performed the ordinary work of making the kingdom visible to itself. When rulers died, the list continued. And as long as the list continued, power could be assembled again. The list continued because grain continued to move. Behind the image of Egypt as a land of temples and tombs stood a more fragile reality. Every monument, army, workshop, and court depended on food gathered from fields that could never be taken for granted. A state that could record the harvest but could not preserve or redistribute it would remain powerful only in favourable years. Egypt's endurance depended on turning seasonal abundance into stored time. The principle was simple. Grain harvested after the flood could survive far longer than most foods if it was properly dried and protected. That made it uniquely valuable in a society where coined money was absent for most of ancient Egyptian history. Grain could be taxed, measured, stored, transported, issued as rations, exchanged, and used to support people far from the fields that had produced it. It was food, wealth, wages, and political leverage at once. Granaries appear in tomb scenes, administrative records, models, and archaeological remains. Some were attached to royal institutions, others to temples, estates, towns, or private households. Their scale varied greatly. Egypt did not possess one enormous national reserve that automatically protected the entire population. Storage was distributed across many institutions, and access depended on status, obligation, location, and political power. Yet this network gave the country a capacity to bridge distance and time. A harvest from one district could feed workers in another. Surplus collected during a good season could support expeditions, military units, craftsmen, temple personnel, or communities facing temporary shortage. Grain payments tied labour to institutions without requiring a fully monetized economy. The famous workers who cut royal tombs at Deir el-Medina, for example, received regular rations, and surviving records reveal how seriously delays were felt. When payments failed, the problem was not abstract finance. It was bread missing from households. One of the most striking episodes occurred late in the New Kingdom, when workers at Deir el-Medina stopped work because their rations were overdue. It is often described as one of the earliest recorded labour strikes. The event is important not because it proves that Egyptian institutions normally functioned well, but because it shows how deeply organised distribution had become. These workers expected grain deliveries as part of a recognised system. When the system failed, they appealed, protested, and sought redress through existing channels rather than abandoning the entire social order. That expectation was part of Egypt's resilience. Institutions were judged by whether they could feed the people attached to them. A king who restored granaries, reopened storehouses, or renewed temple supplies could present practical recovery as moral restoration. Food distribution and Ma'at were not separate worlds. Hunger signalled disorder. Full storehouses became evidence that the land was governed properly. The state's ability to store grain also supported specialization. Stonecutters, metalworkers, soldiers, scribes, priests, and boat crews could not spend every season growing their own food. They relied on agricultural surplus gathered elsewhere. Large-scale administration was therefore possible only because enough grain could be removed from immediate household consumption, stored safely, and directed toward people performing other work. The pyramid fields of Giza, the temple complexes of Thebes, and the garrisons on distant frontiers all depended on this invisible transfer. Yet the system was never as smooth as royal scenes suggest. Grain could spoil, be stolen, mismeasured, or lost to pests. Storehouses required maintenance. Officials could manipulate accounts. Powerful institutions might accumulate reserves while nearby households struggled. Transport could fail if channels became difficult to navigate or local insecurity interrupted movement. A reserve existed only if someone had successfully collected it, protected it, and chosen to release it. This is why environmental stress did not produce the same result everywhere. A low Nile flood might reduce yields across a broad region, but the consequences depended on local storage, social ties, political stability, and access to alternative resources. A district with functioning granaries and strong transport links could endure a poor season better than one already weakened by conflict or excessive extraction. Two communities facing the same river could experience very different crises. The evidence for famine in ancient Egypt is difficult to interpret. Later inscriptions and literary texts sometimes describe hunger in dramatic terms, but such accounts may serve political or religious purposes. A ruler could magnify past suffering to make his own restoration appear greater. Archaeological evidence can reveal stress, abandonment, or changes in diet, but connecting these directly to specific floods or political events remains challenging. Scholars still debate the scale and duration of several proposed famine episodes. Even so, there is no reason to doubt that serious shortages occurred. A civilization lasting millennia experienced droughts, poor floods, crop failures, conflict, and breakdowns in distribution. Egypt's longevity should not be confused with freedom from hunger. The more useful question is why shortages so often fail to erase the social system completely. Part of the answer lies in layers of storage. Households kept food, estates maintained reserves, temples controlled agricultural lands and storehouses. Local authorities could mobilize resources without waiting for the royal court. This distributed structure created inequality, but it also created multiple points of survival. If one institution failed, another might still function. Temples were particularly important because they combined sacred authority with economic capacity. Their estates produced grain, livestock, textiles, and other goods. Their storehouses supported priests, workers, festivals, and dependents. During periods of strong monarchy, temples could be closely tied to royal policy. During periods of weakness, they might act with greater independence. That independence could threaten the crown, but it could also preserve local continuity. Provincial elites played a similar role. Their control over land and labor allowed them to support communities, sponsor construction, and maintain political authority when central institutions contracted. Tomb inscriptions sometimes present such figures as protectors who fed the hungry or supplied their districts during hardship. These claims are self-praising and cannot be accepted without caution, but they reflect an ideal of local leadership grounded in material provision. The same networks that preserved life could also preserve hierarchy. Those who controlled grain controlled dependence. Rations could reward loyalty. Access to storehouses could reinforce the power of temples, officials, or local families. Tax demands could strip households of reserves needed for their own security. Resilience for the state might mean greater vulnerability for the people producing its surplus. That contradiction runs through Egyptian history. The mechanisms that allowed society to survive crisis were not necessarily fair. A centralized system could move food efficiently while extracting heavily from farmers. A local elite could protect a region while entrenching its own privilege. A temple could sustain workers while accumulating wealth beyond royal reach. No single explanation fully accounts for how these tensions were negotiated across different periods. What survives in the record suggests constant adjustment rather than one permanent economic model. Taxation changed. Temple power expanded and contracted. Foreign rulers introduced new systems of revenue. Coinage gradually became more important in later periods. Yet grain remained central because it connected the river's productivity to the needs of institutions. The strength of this arrangement was not that it eliminated lean years. It gave Egypt ways to respond before every poor season became political extinction. Storage bought time. Transport spread risk. Local institutions absorbed shocks. Records made claims and obligations visible. Ritual turned provision into legitimacy. When the Nile disappointed, Egypt did not face the shortage as a collection of isolated households alone. It faced it through granaries, estates, temples, officials, boats, and inherited expectations about who owed food to whom. Those systems sometimes failed, and when they did, the consequences could be severe. But when enough of them held, the country could pass through another season of uncertainty without losing the structures from which recovery might begin. Egypt survived the lean years not because its storehouses were always full, but because the idea of storing, measuring, and redistributing surplus had been woven into the civilization itself. The civilization beneath the storehouses was not made of abstractions. It was made of villages waking before sunrise, fields divided by inherited boundaries, workshops filled with dust and heat, boats loaded with jars and grain, and households whose daily labour kept institutions alive long after royal names had faded from use. Egypt's endurance rested on the fact that most people did not experience history as a sequence of dynasties. They experienced it as another planting season, another delivery, another repair, another marriage alliance, another local dispute, another generation learning how to perform the work that had to be done. The majority of Egyptians lived close to agricultural land. Their survival depended on timing preparing fields as the flood receded, sowing while moisture remained, protecting crops, harvesting before loss, and meeting obligations to estates, temples, officials, or landlords. The tools were simple by later standards, but the knowledge required was not. Farmers understood soils, water movement, seed, livestock, and the small differences between one tract of land and another. That knowledge was rarely written in formal texts. It moved through repeated practice. This practical memory gave local society a durability the palace could not easily command or destroy. A court might change the official responsible for a district, but the people who knew where channels clogged, which fields drained poorly, and which paths remained usable still lived there. A ruler could issue an order to increase production, yet the success of that order depended on people whose understanding of the landscape was older than the decree. Village life was not isolated from the state. Tax collectors, estate managers, labor recruiters, soldiers, and temple representatives entered local worlds regularly. Households owed grain, labor, or other goods. Some men were drawn into seasonal work crews or military service. Boat traffic connected rural districts to towns and administrative centres, but the state's presence was intermittent and uneven. Between official demands, communities managed much of life through kinship, custom, negotiation, and local authority. The evidence for ordinary villages is incomplete because humble buildings rarely survived like temples and tombs. Mud brick houses eroded, were rebuilt, or disappeared beneath later settlements. Most household objects were reused until broken. Written sources were produced mainly by literate institutions and often describe villages from the perspective of officials. Even so, archaeological remains, administrative documents, legal records, and settlements such as Deir el-Medina offer glimpses of a society far more active and complicated than royal art suggests. Deir el-Medina was unusual. Its inhabitants were skilled workers attached to royal tomb construction, and its preservation gives it an exceptional place in the record. Yet the surviving letters, complaints, family records, legal disputes, attendance lists, and domestic remains reveal something broader about Egyptian life. Households planned inheritances, borrowed goods, argued over property, arranged marriages, honoured local gods, and negotiated with officials. Workers could be absent because of illness, religious observance, family responsibilities, or the need to brew beer. The monumental state was supported by people with ordinary problems that did not disappear merely because their labour served eternity. Craft specialists formed another layer of continuity. Potters, carpenters, textile workers, metal workers, stone cutters, leather workers, basket makers, brewers, bakers, and boat builders supplied nearly every institution. Their skills were learned through long practice, often within families or workshops. A dynasty could commission new artistic styles, but it still depended on craftspeople who understood materials at a physical level, how a stone fractured, how wood behaved in dry air, how clay responded to firing, how fibres could be spun and woven, how copper tools needed sharpening and repair. These techniques were not static. Egyptian artisans adopted new materials, forms, and technologies over time. Composite bows, improved chariots, different weapon types, glass production, foreign pottery traditions, and new decorative motifs entered Egypt through trade, migration, and conflict. Local workshops did not simply copy foreign objects, they adapted them to Egyptian needs and tastes. This ability to absorb innovation without abandoning older techniques was one of the civilization's quiet strengths. The same was true in towns, markets, though difficult to reconstruct in detail, connected producers and consumers beyond formal redistribution. People exchanged food, cloth, tools, animals, services, and household goods. Payment might be reckoned in standard values even when no coins changed hands. Institutions dominated large sectors of the economy, but daily exchange could be flexible and personal. A household facing shortage might depend as much on relatives or neighbours as on a granary. Kinship networks provided another form of security. Families shared labour, transmitted property, arranged care, and connected households across settlements. These ties could survive the fall of an official or the movement of a capital. They also shaped political life. Office-holding families placed relatives in administrative positions, temple roles, and local leadership. From the perspective of the royal court, such networks could appear corrupt or dangerously independent. From the perspective of local continuity, they preserved knowledge and responsibility when central oversight weakened. This did not produce a peaceful village world. Property disputes, theft, unequal access to land, and conflicts within families all appear in surviving records. Powerful households could dominate weaker ones. Local officials might exploit their position. Agricultural labour was physically demanding, and obligations to large institutions could become burdensome. Resilience did not mean that people were secure or equal. It meant that social life possessed enough depth to continue through political change. The village also maintained religious continuity. Most Egyptians could not enter the innermost parts of major temples, but religion was present in household shrines, local festivals, amulets, ancestor practices, and devotion to regional gods. People appealed to divine powers for protection, healing, fertility, justice, and success. Local cults connected communities to the wider sacred world without requiring constant contact with the royal centre. Festivals briefly changed the rhythm of ordinary life. Processions carried divine images beyond temple walls. Food and drink were shared. Oracles might answer questions. Communities gathered around rituals that linked local concerns to cosmic order. These events strengthened identity at several scales at once: village, town, region, and kingdom. A person could belong deeply to a local community while still recognizing the religious and political language of Egypt as a whole. That layered identity was essential during fragmentation. When central kingship weakened, people did not lose every framework of belonging. They remained members of families, neighborhoods, work groups, temple communities, and regional traditions. Those smaller structures could preserve forms of cooperation until wider authority returned. This is why the survival of Egypt cannot be read only from monuments. Pyramids reveal the reach of kingship, but not the full source of endurance. The civilization lasted because the skills required for living were widely distributed. Farmers knew how to work the land. Boatmen knew the river. Craftspeople knew materials. Scribes knew procedures. Priests knew rituals. Families knew obligations. Local leaders knew the balance of influence within their communities. When the royal system functioned well, it coordinated and magnified these capacities. When it failed, they did not all disappear with it. Some contracted, some shifted allegiance, and some became more local. What survives in the record suggests continuity beneath political disruption, though the experience varied sharply from place to place. A dynasty could fall because it lost control of officials, revenue, or armies. A village survived for different reasons. It survived because fields still had to be planted, roofs repaired, tools replaced, grain ground, boats caulked, and the dead remembered. These tasks did not wait for political certainty. The monumental state gave Egypt its visible grandeur. The village gave it the ability to outlive grandeur's collapse. The Old Kingdom did not end with one final night of fire. There was no single day when Egypt ceased to exist, no moment when every official abandoned his post and every town fell silent. The change came unevenly. Royal authority weakened, monumental buildings slowed, court networks contracted, provincial leaders became more independent. The centre that had once drawn labour, grain, prestige, and loyalty toward itself could no longer command the entire country with the same force. Later, Egyptian memory turned this age into a warning. Texts described disorder, hunger, reversed social roles, and a world in which the old hierarchy has failed. These accounts are powerful, but they were written or copied under later rulers who benefited from presenting reunification as salvation. They cannot be read as neutral eyewitness reports of every district. Their darkness belongs partly to political memory. The archaeological record is less dramatic and more revealing. It shows disruption, but also activity. In some regions, burials continued. Local workshops remained productive. Provincial elites commissioned tombs and inscriptions. Towns adapted to new political conditions. The collapse of centralized kingship did not erase the knowledge of how to farm, administer estates, maintain cults, or organize communities. It changed where authority was located. The causes of this transformation remain debated. Climate played a role, but not a simple one. Around the end of the 3rd millennium BCE, northeastern Africa and parts of the Near East experienced greater aridity. Nile floods may have become lower or less reliable for a time. Poor harvests would have placed pressure on taxation, storage, and distribution. Yet environmental stress did not strike every region equally, and no single flood record can explain the political collapse of an entire kingdom. The state itself had also changed. Over centuries, royal foundations, temples, and officials accumulated land and privileges. Provincial governors developed local power bases. Offices could become tied to families. The court may have found it harder to collect resources from distant districts while maintaining expensive religious and administrative obligations. Long reigns and uncertain succession may have added further strain. No single explanation fully accounts for the end of the Old Kingdom because the failure was probably cumulative. A system built around strong central coordination can appear stable until several of its supports weaken together. Reduced agricultural surplus limits what the court can distribute. Less distribution weakens loyalty. Stronger provincial elites retain more resources locally. Monumental projects shrink, reducing the visible display of royal power. Succession disputes make obedience less certain. Each problem deepens the others. Yet the same provincial strength that weakened the crown also prevented complete social disintegration. Local leaders could organize labor, support temples, manage land, and defend their own interests. They did not always govern well, and their rivalry could intensify conflict. But their survival meant that administration continued outside the palace. This is one of the clearest examples of Egypt's ability to fail in pieces. The royal centre lost its old reach, but the provinces did not become empty territory. Their institutions had grown within the Old Kingdom system and now operated with greater independence. The very decentralization that marked the collapse also preserved many of the structures later rulers would need. At sites in Middle and Upper Egypt, local elites left inscriptions presenting themselves as providers and protectors. They claimed to have fed their communities, maintained order, and cared for the vulnerable during difficult years. Such statements are self-promotional. They may exaggerate hardship and generosity alike. Still, they reveal what local authority was expected to do when the king could no longer guarantee stability from afar. Power became more personal and regional. Loyalty attached to governors, families, and towns. Artistic styles changed as provincial workshops worked with less direct connection to royal centres. Burial practices broadened in ways that later historians once interpreted as a decline from Old Kingdom perfection. A better reading sees adaptation. Local communities used available resources and reshaped elite traditions according to new conditions. Even funerary ideas became more widely accessible. Texts and symbols once closely associated with royal burial appeared in the tombs of non-royal elites. This development was gradual and uneven, but it suggests that political fragmentation could open cultural space. As the monopoly of the court weakened, regional actors claimed traditions that had once reinforced royal exclusivity. The first intermediate period was therefore not merely an age of loss. It was also a laboratory of political survival. Different regions experimented with authority. Local rulers competed, formed alliances, and built new identities. Two major centres eventually emerged: Heracleopolis in the north and Thebes in the south. Their rivalry transformed regional resilience into a struggle for reunification. Thebes was not the obvious heir to the Old Kingdom. It had not been the ancient centre of pyramid kingship. Its rise demonstrates that recovery did not require the restoration of the old capital or the return of the same ruling families. A new political centre could claim the old ideal of national unity. The Theban rulers expanded gradually. They secured local support, controlled routes, confronted rivals, and turned regional authority into a wider project. Their eventual victory under Mentuhotep II brought much of Egypt together again and established the foundation of the Middle Kingdom. Later tradition remembered this as restoration, but the restored state was not simply the Old Kingdom revived. It carried the experience of fragmentation within it. Provincial power could no longer be treated as an accidental weakness. Local elites had demonstrated their capacity to survive without the court. The new rulers had to integrate, restrain, reward, or replace them. Administrative arrangements changed. Royal ideology emphasized reunification, but practical government required negotiation with institutions strengthened during the period of division. This pattern would become deeply important to Egypt's long history. Collapse destroyed a political balance, but it also revealed which parts of society could function independently. Reunification then recombined those parts into a different system. The result looked ancient because it used familiar crowns, gods, titles, and rituals. Beneath those forms, power had been reorganized. The survival of identity was equally significant. Egyptians in rival regions did not necessarily think of themselves as belonging to wholly separate civilizations. Local loyalties were real, but the idea of the two lands remained available. The north and south could be ruled by competing houses while still being imagined as parts of one rightful order. That shared political memory made reunification more than conquest. It allowed victory to be presented as repair. The evidence remains incomplete, especially for ordinary households. Some communities may have suffered severely. Others may have experienced greater local autonomy or economic continuity. There was no single first intermediate period lived in the same way by every Egyptian. The phrase covers decades of shifting conditions across a long and varied country. What matters is what did not disappear. The river still connected settlements. Agricultural knowledge remained. Temples continued ritual life. Scribes preserved administrative practice. Local rulers maintained labor and resources. Craftspeople continued to work. The language of kingship survived even when no king controlled the whole land. When the center finally returned, it did not descend upon a blank landscape. It found a society that had already endured the absence of unity. The Old Kingdom had fallen, but Egypt had not been destroyed. It had broken into smaller worlds that still remembered how they belonged together. The rulers who rebuilt Egypt after the first intermediate period inherited more than a divided country. They inherited proof that unity could fail, that provinces could survive without the old court, and that local families could become powerful enough to rival the crown. Reunification, therefore, could not mean simply restoring the past exactly as it had been. The Middle Kingdom emerged by combining the ancient ideal of the two lands with a more practical understanding of how authority actually worked. Mentuhotep II of Thebes is usually credited with completing the reunification of Egypt around the beginning of the second millennium BCE, although the precise sequence of campaigns and political settlements remains debated. His victory over northern rivals ended one phase of fragmentation, but it did not instantly erase regional loyalties or rebuild a centralized state overnight. The process required years of consolidation. Military success opened the way. Administration, patronage, ritual, and negotiation made the new order durable. The Theban court presented reunification as a restoration of Maat. Division had been overcome. The two lands were joined again. Temples were renewed, royal building resumed, and the king appeared as the defender of order. Yet the state that followed was not simply a copy of the old kingdom. It had been shaped by the experience of decentralization. Provincial elites remained central to government. Many had deep roots in their regions, controlled estates, commanded local loyalty, and maintained networks of officials and dependents. A ruler attempting to remove all of them at once would have risked new rebellion or administrative paralysis. The early Middle Kingdom therefore worked through a mixture of accommodation and control. Some local families retained influence. Others were bound to the crown through office, marriage, gifts, or access to royal favour. Over time, certain provincial powers were reduced, reorganised, or absorbed into a stronger central administration. This was less a clean reform than a gradual recalibration. Evidence varies from one district to another, and scholars still debate how directly the crown controlled provincial officials at different moments. What survives suggests that rulers learned to govern through layered authority, rather than imagining that royal commands alone could hold the country together. The royal court itself also changed location. The early reunifiers remained connected to Thebes, but later rulers of the 12th dynasty established a new residence in the north, probably near the entrance to the Fayoum. The city is known as Ishtawi, though its exact archaeological location has not been securely identified. Its name proclaimed that the ruler had seized or bound the two lands, turning geography into a political message. The choice was strategic. A capital near the junction between Upper Egypt and the Delta allowed the court to oversee both regions more effectively. It also placed the dynasty closer to agricultural resources, trade routes, and long-established administrative centres. The move did not abandon Thebes, which remained religiously and politically important. Instead, it created a more balanced network of power. The Middle Kingdom rulers strengthened royal administration, expanded agricultural development, reorganized labour, and renewed long-distance expeditions. They worked stone quarries, reopened routes through the deserts, and pushed Egyptian influence southward into Nubia. Forts appeared along the Nile in the Cataract region, forming one of the most remarkable frontier systems of the ancient world. These forts were not merely walls against invasion, they regulated trade, movement, communication, and military activity. Officials monitored people and goods passing through the region. Garrisons supported Egyptian claims to territory and protected access to resources, especially gold. Written dispatches from the frontier reveal a world of patrols, reports, local negotiation, and careful observation. Empire began not only with conquest, but with paperwork. The southern expansion also shows how recovery could produce ambition. A state that had recently emerged from fragmentation was soon projecting power beyond its core. Yet this expansion was measured differently from the later imperial campaigns of the New Kingdom. The Middle Kingdom focused heavily on securing routes, controlling strategic points, and integrating frontier administration into the restored state. At home, rulers invested in the Fayoum region, where water management and agricultural development increased the value of land. The scale and exact nature of these projects remain debated, and older accounts sometimes exaggerated them into a single enormous royal reclamation scheme. More cautious interpretations point to long-term efforts involving channels, settlements, estates, and administrative organisation. The important point is that the restored state sought not only to collect resources, but to reshape how resources could be produced. This practical rebuilding was matched by cultural confidence. The Middle Kingdom became a period later Egyptians looked back upon as classical. Its literary language, stories, instructions, hymns, and royal texts were copied for centuries. Scribes studied works associated with this era long after the political world that produced them had disappeared. The restored state did more than reunify territory. It created models of kingship, morality, eloquence, and administration that future generations could reuse. This cultural legacy mattered because it gave Egypt another layer of memory. After the Old Kingdom, rulers could look back to the age of pyramids. After the Middle Kingdom, they also possessed a model of successful recovery. The civilization now remembered not only ancient greatness, but reunification itself. Literature from the period often reflects anxiety beneath the restored order. Stories describe wandering, exile, unstable loyalty, dangerous frontiers, and the fear of social reversal. The famous tale of Sinuhe follows an official who flees Egypt after the death of a king and eventually longs to return. The narrative is literary rather than a transparent historical account, but its emotional world is revealing. Egypt is portrayed as the proper center of identity, while life beyond its borders remains uncertain, even when comfortable. Other texts present ideal rulers who listen, judge, provide, and restrain disorder. Their emphasis on good kingship suggests that political stability was understood as something requiring effort. The trauma of division had not been forgotten. It had been transformed into instruction. Succession was one of the dangers rulers tried to manage more carefully. Some Middle Kingdom kings may have associated heirs with the throne before their own deaths, although the evidence for formal corrigences remains debated. The underlying concern is clear. A dynasty that failed to transfer power smoothly risked reopening the fractures of the past. The 12th dynasty achieved unusual continuity, but not permanence. Court rivalries, changing provincial relationships, economic pressures, and uncertain succession eventually weaken the system. The 13th dynasty saw more rapid turnover among rulers. Central authority contracted once again, especially in the Delta, where new political centers and communities of Southwest Asian origin became increasingly influential. The restored order therefore contained the seeds of another fragmentation. That does not diminish its achievement. It reveals the deeper rhythm of Egyptian survival. Reunification did not end history. It rebuilt institutions strongly enough to carry society through another long phase of change. The Middle Kingdom demonstrates that resilience is not the restoration of an untouched past. It is the ability to reuse inherited forms while reorganizing the structures beneath them. The crowns remained familiar. The language of Mayat returned. Temples, offices, and royal rituals connected the new dynasty to ancient authority. Yet provincial power was handled differently. The capital shifted. Frontiers were managed more systematically, and cultural memory became richer. Egypt recovered because it could distinguish between what had to appear eternal and what had to change. The ideal of unity remained fixed. The machinery used to achieve it did not. By the time the Middle Kingdom began to weaken, Egypt had already proved something extraordinary. A civilization could pass through political collapse, preserve enough of itself locally, and then rebuild a state that felt both ancient and new. The next crisis would bring foreign rulers into the heart of the Delta. But even that transformation would not erase the pattern. Egypt had learned how to absorb disruption and turn it into another story of return. The next fragmentation did not begin with a single invasion crashing through Egypt's borders. It developed gradually in the eastern delta, where trade, migration, local power, and political weakness had been reshaping society for generations. Communities from Southwest Asia had long settled in the region. They worked, traded, raised families, and became part of the economic life of northern Egypt. By the time rulers later called the Hyksos held power from Avaris, the line between foreign arrival and local transformation had already become difficult to draw. The word Hyksos comes from an Egyptian title meaning rulers of foreign lands. It did not refer to one clearly defined ethnic nation marching into Egypt as a united people. Modern popular accounts sometimes imagine a sudden conquest by an unknown warrior race armed with revolutionary weapons. The evidence is more complicated. The rise of Hyksos power appears to have emerged from communities already established in the Delta, taking advantage of the weakening authority of the late Middle Kingdom and the fragmentation that followed. This distinction matters because it reveals a recurring strength of Egyptian society. Foreign presence did not always arrive as total replacement. Newcomers entered existing towns, ports, farms, households, and trading networks. Their customs mixed with the local practices. Their leaders adopted elements of Egyptian kingship, even while maintaining connections to Southwest Asian traditions. Political control changed, but the cultural landscape did not become blank. Avaris, at Tel El Daba, stood at the center of this transformation. Its position in the eastern delta connected the Nile Valley to Sinai and the Levant. The settlement grew through trade and migration before becoming the capital of the Hyksos rulers. Archaeology reveals a community shaped by several worlds at once: burial customs, architecture, ceramics, religious practices, and material culture show strong links to Southwest Asia. Yet these existed within an Egyptian environment and increasingly interacted with Egyptian institutions. The city demonstrates why frontier regions were so important to Egypt's resilience. They were vulnerable to outside influence, but they were also places where new connections formed. Avaris links inland agriculture to international exchange. Merchants, craftsmen, sailors, soldiers, and families moved through its networks. When central authority weakened, those networks did not disappear. They became the foundation of a new political center. The Hyksos adopted pharaonic titles and used Egyptian royal forms. They participated in the established language of kingship because ruling Egypt required more than military control. Temples, officials, estates, and local communities recognized authority through symbols that had accumulated meaning over centuries. A foreign ruler could bring different ancestry, alliances, and military traditions. But legitimacy in Egypt was easier to claim through the crown, titulary, and rituals already understood by the population. This did not make Hyksos rule culturally identical to native dynasties. Their court maintained distinctive connections and practices. Certain deities, especially the storm god associated with the Egyptian Seth, gained prominence in ways suited to a ruling house with Levantine ties. Material culture remained mixed. What survives suggests not simple assimilation, but selective adaptation. Technology formed part of this exchange. Horse-drawn chariots, composite bows, new forms of weaponry, and military equipment became more prominent in Egypt around this period. Older narratives sometimes claim that the Hyksos introduced every major innovation in a sudden military revolution. The chronology is less certain. Some technologies may have entered gradually through trade and contact, and their adoption likely varied. Scholars still debate the exact pathways. What is clear is that the political crisis accelerated Egypt's engagement with methods of warfare already developing across the Near East. The southern part of Egypt remained under rulers based at Thebes. Their domain preserved its own administration, military leadership, religious institutions, and claims to kingship. Egypt was divided again, but neither half represented a complete cultural disappearance. Thebes and Avaris competed within a political world that both understood through Egyptian forms. The struggle between them eventually became war. The surviving sources come mainly from the victorious Theban side and portray the conflict as a national liberation from foreign oppression. Such texts serve the ideology of the emerging new kingdom and must be treated cautiously. They simplified decades of coexistence, negotiation, rivalry, and shifting control into a moral drama of disorder expelled by rightful kings. Even so, military confrontation was real. Theban rulers expanded northward, and the campaigns associated with Seqenenretau, Kamos, and Ahmose I eventually destroyed Hyksos' political power in the delta. Ahmose pursued enemies beyond Egypt and established the dynasty that would inaugurate the new kingdom. Yet the victory did not restore a supposedly untouched Egypt. The reunified state inherited technologies, populations, trade connections, and military lessons shaped by the period of division. Chariots and composite bows became central to New Kingdom warfare. The eastern delta remained strategically vital. Egyptian rulers pushed their armies into the Levant, partly because the Hyksos experience had shown that threats could not always be contained at the traditional border. Crisis had changed the country's strategic imagination. Earlier rulers often defended the Nile Valley through controlled frontiers and selective expeditions. The new kingdom increasingly sought security through expansion. By controlling territory and allied rulers in Southwest Asia, pharaohs hoped to prevent another foreign dynasty from establishing itself in Egypt's exposed northeast. The Hyksos period therefore contributed indirectly to the rise of Egyptian empire. A political fracture became a lesson in frontier vulnerability, military adaptation, and the value of international power. The response was not merely to rebuild the old order, but to create a more outward-facing state. Foreign communities did not vanish when Hyksos rule ended. People of Southwest Asian origin continued to live in Egypt. Some served in military, administrative, or economic roles. Migration across the northeastern frontier remained constant. The royal claim of expelling foreigners was therefore ideological rather than a literal removal of everyone with foreign ancestry. This pattern continued throughout Egyptian history. Nubians served as soldiers, police, laborers, and officials, while Egyptian states occupied parts of Nubia and absorbed its wealth and people. Libyan groups entered the western delta and later formed military communities whose leaders rose to royal power. Mercenaries from the Aegean and Southwest Asia served later pharaohs. Foreign merchants settled in Egyptian towns. Captives, diplomats, artisans, and migrants became part of local society. Egyptian identity proved durable partly because it was not biologically sealed. It was reproduced through language, institutions, religion, place, and participation in social order. A person or ruling family could be treated as foreign in one context and become increasingly Egyptian in another. The process was never equal or peaceful. Foreigners could face suspicion, stereotyping, forced labor, or exclusion. Royal art often reduced external peoples to symbolic enemies. Yet daily reality was more entangled than official imagery admitted. The state classified outsiders, but it also used them. Skilled soldiers strengthened armies, traders widened access to materials, migrant communities connected Egypt to distant markets. Foreign technologies were adopted when useful. Gods and rituals crossed borders. Egyptian endurance depended partly on the ability to absorb what had once appeared external. This adaptability became even clearer when rulers of foreign origin later governed the entire country. Libyan dynasts adopted pharaonic titles. Kushite kings from Nubia presented themselves as restorers of Egyptian religious order. Persian emperors appeared in Egyptian royal form when addressing Egyptian audiences. Macedonian and Ptolemaic rulers supported temples, commissioned inscriptions, and entered the ritual framework of kingship. Such rulers did not become indistinguishable from earlier dynasties, and foreign domination could bring rebellion, extraction, and conflict. But conquest repeatedly failed to eliminate the cultural system it sought to control. The conqueror often had to pass through Egyptian institutions in order to rule effectively. The Hyksos episode reveals the mechanism early and clearly. Egypt's frontier opened, a foreign-linked dynasty rose, the country divided, the southern state resisted, adapted, and eventually reunified the valley. But the restored kingdom carried the marks of the period it had condemned. New military practices, stronger international ambitions, and a transformed eastern delta became part of Egypt's future. The foreign rulers were expelled from power, yet the world they helped create remained. Egypt survived not by refusing change, but by deciding which parts of change could be made Egyptian. The Egypt that emerged from the Hyksos period no longer trusted distance alone to keep danger away. Its rulers had seen a foreign dynasty rise within the delta, had watched the country divide, and had learned that threats could grow slowly through trade, migration, and political weakness before becoming military power. The answer of the early New Kingdom was not simply to defend Egypt's borders, it was to push those borders outward. Under the rulers of the 18th dynasty, Egyptian armies moved south into Nubia and northeast into the Levant. Garrisons, forts, tribute systems, diplomatic relationships, and local client rulers created a broad zone of influence beyond the Nile Valley. The logic was clear. If Egypt controlled the routes and states beyond its traditional frontiers, hostile powers would find it harder to reach the delta or threaten the gold-producing regions of the south. Empire became a shield built at a distance. This outward strategy transformed Egypt. Nubian gold flowed toward the royal court and temples, timber, metals, horses, luxury goods, captives, and tribute entered the country through imperial networks. Military officers gained wealth and prestige. Egyptian officials governed or supervised foreign territories. The court could support construction on a scale not seen for centuries. Temples expanded, especially those associated with Amun at Thebes, whose priesthood received enormous gifts from victorious rulers. The wealth of empire reinforced the image of Pharaoh as defender of order. Temple walls showed the king defeating foreign enemies, receiving tribute, and extending divine authority over distant lands. These scenes were not objective reports. They compressed complicated campaigns, negotiations, and political arrangements into a repeated image of effortless victory. A ruler who fought several uncertain battles could still be represented as the sole conqueror of entire peoples. Behind the imagery stood a more demanding reality. Armies had to be recruited, supplied, transported, and commanded. Chariots required trained horses, skilled drivers, craftsmen, and access to suitable materials. Garrisons needed food and replacement personnel. Roads, river routes, and coastal shipping had to remain secure. Local rulers had to be rewarded, threatened, or replaced. Messages travelled between courts, and diplomatic marriages helped hold alliances together. The empire was therefore another administrative achievement. Military power could win a city, but only continuing organization could turn victory into tribute and strategic depth. Egyptian scribes recorded deliveries, correspondence, troop movements, and foreign obligations. Officials learned to operate across languages and political systems. Sons of foreign elites were sometimes brought to Egypt, where exposure to the royal court could make them useful allies when they returned home. This was not simply cultural domination flowing in one direction. Egypt absorbed influences from the territories it controlled. Foreign words entered the language. New gods and religious practices appeared. Levantine goods became familiar. Horses and chariotry reshaped elite warfare. Diplomatic exchange connected the pharaoh to other great rulers who did not treat him as the only king in the world, whatever Egyptian monuments claimed. The surviving international letters from the late Bronze Age reveal a world of negotiation beneath the monumental certainty. Great kings addressed one another as brothers, exchanged gifts, complained about inadequate shipments, arranged marriages, and debated the fate of smaller states. Egypt was powerful, but it belonged to a network of powers that included Hatti, Babylonia, Mitanni, and later Assyria. Its security depended partly on the stability of that wider system. At its height, this international position brought extraordinary advantages. Egypt could draw wealth from territories beyond the Nile, influence trade, and confront rivals far from its agricultural heartland. Yet every extension of power created new obligations. A rebellion in a distant city required a response. A rival kingdom's expansion could threaten alliances. Tribute depended on military credibility. The shield had to be maintained constantly. The campaigns of Thutmose III illustrate both the reach and the burden of empire. His victories established Egyptian dominance across much of the Levant, and later, inscriptions turned his reign into a model of military kingship. Yet control was never absolute. Local rulers retained their own interests. Revolts occurred. Egyptian forces returned repeatedly, because a single campaign could not create permanent obedience. The reigns that followed combined warfare with diplomacy. Amenhotep III governed during a period of immense wealth and international prestige, exchanging gifts and marriages with foreign courts. His monuments projected calm confidence. But the stability of the system depended on relationships that could change quickly. When the royal court shifted its religious focus under Akhenaten, foreign correspondence reveals anxious local rulers requesting help against enemies. Historians still debate how far Egypt's position actually deteriorated during this reign, but the letters expose the gap between imperial image and frontier uncertainty. Later kings worked to restore authority abroad. Seti I and Rameses II campaigned in the Levant, confronting the Hittite Empire for influence over strategic cities and routes. The Battle of Kadesh became one of antiquity's most celebrated military encounters, largely because Rameses II covered temples with accounts of his personal courage. In reality, the battle produced no decisive Egyptian conquest. Both sides later accepted a peace treaty, recognizing that continued rivalry had become costly. That treaty is a revealing sign of maturity rather than weakness. Egypt survived not only through victory but through compromise. Rameses II could present the agreement as a triumph while accepting a political balance with another great power. Dynastic marriage and diplomacy achieved what repeated campaigns had not. Adaptation again mattered more than ideological consistency. The imperial system also tied military power closely to the temples. Victorious rulers granted land, workers, livestock, and treasure to major cult institutions. These gifts reinforced divine legitimacy and financed rituals, but they also increased the independent resources of priesthoods. The Temple of Amun at Karnak became particularly powerful. What strengthened the monarchy in one generation could weaken its financial flexibility in another. The army developed its own institutional weight. Military families gained land and office. Commanders became politically influential. Foreign troops, especially Nubians and groups of Libyan origin, served Egyptian rulers. The state benefited from a diverse military force, but powerful commanders and settled military communities could later shape succession and regional politics. Empire thus altered the balance within Egypt itself. Wealth flowed inward, but so did new concentrations of power. The court, temples, army, and administrative elite all grew through imperial success. Their cooperation supported the new kingdom's greatness. Their rivalry would become dangerous when resources declined. The costs were not only political. Large construction programs, military expeditions, royal courts, and temple estates consumed enormous quantities of grain, labor, and material, as long as tribute, taxation, and agricultural production remained sufficient. The system could sustain them. When foreign income weakened or internal distribution faltered, the same scale became a burden. Egypt's empire was never a uniform territory controlled equally from the Nile. Nubia was integrated more directly in some periods, with forts, settlements, temples, and Egyptian officials extending far south. The Levant was often governed through local rulers whose loyalty shifted with circumstances. Different frontiers required different methods. What survives in the record suggests continuous adjustment rather than one fixed imperial design. For several centuries, that design worked well enough to keep major rivals away from Egypt's core. The country became richer, more militarized, and more internationally connected. Its rulers could imagine that the old vulnerability had been solved. Danger would be defeated before it reached the Nile. But a shield built far from home can become difficult to hold when the world beyond it begins to fracture. By the late 13th and early 12th centuries BCE, drought, migration, warfare, rebellion, political rivalry, and disruptions in trade were placing pressure on states across the eastern Mediterranean. The exact sequence remains debated, and no single explanation fully accounts for the crisis that followed. Egypt would survive that wider collapse, but not with its empire intact. The outer defences would contract, foreign revenues would weaken, military victories would conceal deep internal strain. The state that had expanded to prevent another invasion would discover that survival sometimes required abandoning the very territories meant to protect it. The world beyond Egypt's shield did not collapse in one blow. It unravelled through overlapping failures. Palaces burned or were abandoned. Trade routes became unreliable. Coastal settlements faced violence and migration. Drought and poor harvests placed pressure on food systems already strained by war and political rivalry. In the Hittite realm, central authority disappeared. Across the Aegean, many Mycenaean palace centres fell and were never restored in the same form. Cities in the Levant suffered destruction, contraction, or sudden change. The crisis around 1200 BCE was not one event, and scholars still debate the relative weight of climate, rebellion, invasion, migration, and economic breakdown. What is clear is that several systems failed close together, and each failure made the others harder to contain. Egypt entered this crisis as a great power, but not as an untouched observer. It faced threats on multiple fronts, and its imperial network was becoming more expensive to defend. Royal inscriptions from the reigns of Merneptah and Rameses III describe battles against Libyan groups and coalitions from the eastern Mediterranean. Modern historians often group some of these peoples under the label Sea Peoples, but the term can mislead. The Egyptian texts list different groups with different origins and motives. They may have included raiders, migrants, displaced warriors, families, and fragments of communities uprooted by wider collapse. They were not necessarily one united nation moving under a single command. The inscriptions also belong to royal propaganda. They show pharaohs crushing enemies because temple walls were designed to present victory, not uncertainty. Ramesses III's monuments at Medinet Habu portray Egypt as the fortress that stood while foreign lands were overturned. The scenes are dramatic, but they are not a complete record. They tell us that Egypt faced serious military pressure. They do not prove that one decisive battle ended the crisis. Egypt's armies did repel major attacks. That mattered. A state already weakened by poor harvests or internal rivalry might not have survived an invasion reaching the heart of the delta. The Nile Valley's concentrated population, transport system, fortifications, and military institutions gave the government resources that some neighbouring powers no longer possessed. Egypt could still gather troops, provision them, and coordinate defence. Its administrative habits turned agricultural wealth into military endurance. Yet the victory scenes conceal the cost. Soldiers had to be fed. Fleets and chariot forces had to be maintained. Frontier defence absorbed resources while foreign tribute and trade became less dependable. Egypt may have prevented enemies from destroying the state, but it could not restore the international system on which New Kingdom power had partly depended. The Hittite Empire did not return. Many palace networks across the eastern Mediterranean did not recover. Diplomatic exchange shrank. Egyptian authority in the Levant weakened and eventually disappeared. This was the difference between survival and continued dominance. Egypt remained a state, but it ceased to be the same kind of empire. It lost the outer layer of control that had once provided tribute, strategic depth, and prestige. In the longer story of Egyptian endurance, this was also a form of contraction that protected the core. The country could withdraw toward the Nile Valley because its main food-producing population was already concentrated there. Losing foreign territories damaged royal revenue and military credibility, but it did not remove the agricultural heartland. Egypt's rulers could no longer act as unquestioned masters of the eastern Mediterranean, yet they still governed a land with large settlements, temples, fields, boats, officials, and inherited systems of collection. The empire outside could fall away while the civilization within continued. That advantage should not be exaggerated. The decades after Ramesses III reveal severe internal strain. Records from Deir el-Medina describe delayed grain rations and work stoppages. Tomb robberies increased, suggesting both economic desperation and weakening control. Officials investigated corruption while sometimes participating in it. Royal burials, once guarded as eternal houses, were opened and plundered. The state's symbolic centre was no longer secure from the pressures spreading through society. The royal court also faced political violence and succession problems. A conspiracy against Ramesses III involved members of the palace and aimed to alter the succession. Surviving documents reveal trials and punishments, though the exact sequence remains debated. The episode shows that danger no longer came only from foreign shores. The machinery of kingship itself was under stress. Powerful institutions protected their own resources. The temples of Amun controlled extensive lands and personnel, especially in Upper Egypt. Their wealth had grown through centuries of royal gifts. During the later New Kingdom, high priests at Thebes gained increasing authority. In the north, kings and military leaders retained separate bases of power. Egypt survived the Bronze Age collapse. but the balance holding the centralized state together was weakening. This again reveals the double edge of resilience. Temple estates, provincial networks, and military households preserved organization when royal authority declined. They kept land productive, maintained local administration, and supported communities. But their strength also reduced the crown's ability to command the entire country. The institutions that prevented total collapse helped produce political fragmentation. By the end of the New Kingdom, Egypt was divided in practice between northern rulers and the powerful priestly administration at Thebes. The transition into the Third Intermediate Period did not resemble the disappearance of the Hittite capital or the abandonment of many Mycenaean palaces. Egyptian kingship continued. Temples remained active. Scribes still copied texts. Burial practices, artistic traditions, and religious institutions changed but did not vanish. The state had contracted and split. Yet the civilization retained enough continuity to move into another political form. The comparison with neighbouring powers must be made carefully. The Hittite world did not become empty after imperial collapse, and communities in Greece and the Levant also survived and adapted. Collapse rarely means the extinction of populations. What disappeared in those regions were particular palace systems, ruling dynasties, administrative scripts, and long-distance networks. Egypt's unusual achievement was that so many central cultural and institutional traditions remained recognizable even as imperial power shrank. Several advantages worked together. The Nile supplied a substantial domestic agricultural base. River transport linked the core. Deserts and controlled approaches made full conquest difficult. Administration and storage allowed the state to mobilize food and labor. Temples and local authorities retained resources outside the palace. A deeply rooted ideology made restoration imaginable after division. None of these factors alone guaranteed survival. Together, they made cascading failure less likely to destroy every layer at once. A society becomes especially vulnerable when politics, food supply, trade, defense, and legitimacy depend too heavily on the same connected system. If several important nodes fail together, disruption spreads rapidly. Egypt was part of the Late Bronze Age network, but it was not wholly contained by it. International exchange enriched the court and supported empire. Yet the Nile Valley could still feed much of the population when that exchange contracted. The failure of the outer network did not automatically switch off the inner one. Still, the country paid heavily for survival. Its imperial age ended, royal authority weakened, economic strain deepened, political unity fractured. Later Egyptians would remember the New Kingdom's great conquerors, but thus not recover the same position abroad. Survival preserved Egypt, not its former scale. This may be the clearest answer to why Egypt endured when other powers seemed to disappear. It was capable of losing greatness without losing identity. It could surrender territory, wealth, and international influence while keeping the river, the temples, the scribes, the villages, and the conviction that the two lands still belong together. The Bronze Age world around it changed beyond recognition. Egypt changed with it. But because the collapse reached different parts of the Egyptian system at different depths, enough remained intact for history to continue. A kingdom can survive drought, civil war, and the collapse of an empire, yet still disappear when outsiders take the throne, replace its institutions, and redefine the land in their own language. Egypt endured repeated conquests, but the result was rarely simple cultural erasure. Again and again, foreign rulers discovered that controlling the Nile Valley was easier than replacing the civilization that had grown around it. By the first millennium BCE, political authority in Egypt was often divided among dynasties with roots beyond the old royal houses. Libyan military families, whose ancestors had settled in the delta and served in Egyptian forces, rose to positions of power. Some eventually became pharaohs. Their reigns are sometimes described as foreign rule. But by the time they held the crown, they were deeply entangled with Egyptian institutions. They adopted royal titulary, supported temples, and governed through local elites. Their ancestry mattered, yet so did the fact that Egyptian kingship provided the most effective language of legitimacy. This pattern reveals how identity worked in ancient Egypt. It was not simply inherited through blood, it was performed through titles, rituals, language, patronage, and participation in the social order. A ruler could arrive from outside the traditional royal line and still present himself as the restorer of Maat. The claim might be contested, and local opposition could remain strong, but the cultural framework survived because even ambitious outsiders found it useful. The Kushite rulers of the 25th dynasty made this especially clear. Coming from the Kingdom of Kush to the south, they conquered Egypt during a period of division and presented themselves not as destroyers of Egyptian tradition, but as its defenders. They supported temples, revived older artistic forms, and drew heavily on the prestige of earlier periods. Their monuments sometimes used deliberately archaic styles, creating a visible connection to a past imagined as purer and more ordered. This was not simple imitation. Kush had long interacted with Egypt through trade, war, migration, religion, and political exchange. Nubian communities had served Egyptian states for centuries, while Egyptian rule had shaped parts of Nubia. By the time Kushite kings governed Egypt, the cultural relationship between the two regions was already deep and complicated. Their reign shows that a conqueror could treat Egyptian tradition as a source of authority, while also bringing a distinct political identity from beyond the Nile's southern frontier. The Assyrian invasions of the 7th century BCE brought a more destructive form of intervention. Assyrian armies campaigned into Egypt, defeated local rulers, and sacked important cities, including Thebes. An empire with sufficient military organization could penetrate deeply into the valley. Yet Assyrian control remained difficult to sustain. Distance, local resistance, and the complexity of governing the country limited permanent occupation. After Assyrian power receded, Egyptian rulers of the Site period restored a native dynasty and revived older forms once again. They employed Greek and Carian mercenaries, expanded trade, and ruled a society already connected to the Mediterranean world. Their use of foreign soldiers and merchants did not make the state less Egyptian. It showed that restoration could include new tools, allies, and populations. Persian conquest posed another test. Egypt became part of the Achaemenid Empire in the late 6th century BCE and later again in the 4th. Persian kings incorporated the country into a vast imperial system stretching across several regions. They demanded revenue and strategic cooperation, and Egyptian resistance repeatedly challenged their rule. Revolts, reconquests, and periods of native restoration reveal that Persian authority was neither universally accepted nor continuously secure. Yet Persian rulers also adopted Egyptian royal forms when governing the country. They appeared in temple reliefs as pharaohs, made offerings to Egyptian gods, and used titles that connected them to the established order. The Achaemenid court remained Persian, and imperial policy served wider interests. But Egyptian temples and elites still mediated authority at the local level. Conquest changed who stood at the top without immediately dissolving the structures beneath. The arrival of Alexander the Great and the rise of the Ptolemaic dynasty transformed Egypt more deeply. Greek-speaking rulers governed from Alexandria, a new Mediterranean capital that became one of the great cities of the ancient world. The Ptolemaic state drew on Macedonian monarchy, Greek administration, Egyptian taxation, temple networks, and a diverse population. Greek settlers received land and offices. New legal and linguistic divisions appeared. Alexandria looked outward toward the sea as much as inward toward the Nile. Even so, the Ptolemies did not abandon Egyptian kingship. In temples across the country, they were represented in traditional form, wearing ancient crowns and making offerings to the gods. Priests produced decrees that linked royal authority to Egyptian religious institutions. The famous Rosetta Stone belongs to this world of negotiated legitimacy, recording a priestly decree in hieroglyphic, demotic, and Greek. Its 3 scripts reveal not one unified culture, but a state operating through several overlapping audiences. The Ptolemies supported temple construction on a large scale. Some of the best preserved Egyptian temples, including those at Edfu and Dendera, belong substantially to this late period. Their walls preserve rituals, myths, and priestly knowledge in forms that appear deeply traditional, even though they were produced under a Greek-speaking dynasty. This is one of the most surprising features of Egyptian endurance. Some monuments that modern visitors experience as timelessly pharaonic were built when the country had already been ruled by foreigners for centuries. Continuity, however, did not mean harmony. The Ptolemaic kingdom faced rebellions, ethnic tensions, economic pressure, court conflict, and regional resistance. Egyptian communities did not simply accept foreign rule because temples remained open. Some revolts established rival pharaohs in Upper Egypt. Administrative distinctions between Greek and Egyptian institutions could reinforce inequality. The evidence remains incomplete, and the experience varied by place and status. What endured was not political independence, but a cultural system strong enough to negotiate with domination. Priests, scribes, local elites, farmers, and temple communities continued to reproduce Egyptian forms. Foreign rulers needed tax revenue, agricultural stability, and ritual legitimacy. That dependence gave older institutions space to survive, though often under new constraints. Roman conquest in 30 BCE ended the Ptolemaic dynasty and marked the conventional end of ancient Egypt's pharaonic political history. Egypt became a province ruled for the benefit of Rome, valued especially for its grain. The emperor could still appear as pharaoh in temple imagery, but he did not reside in Egypt or govern as earlier kings had. Administrative priorities shifted toward an imperial system centered elsewhere. Even then, Egyptian religion, language, and temple life did not disappear immediately. Hieroglyphic inscriptions continued for centuries. Demotic remained in use. Temples functioned, local cults persisted, and Egyptian artistic traditions adapted to new social worlds. Over time, however, the conditions that had sustained the old system weakened. Temple wealth declined, priestly institutions contracted, Christianity expanded, and knowledge of hieroglyphic writing eventually vanished. This final transformation differed from earlier conquests because the chain of transmission itself was gradually broken. Previous foreign rulers had often preserved temples and scribal traditions because they needed them. Under Roman and late antique conditions, those institutions lost their central place. Egyptian civilization did not end in one moment, but the mechanisms that had repeatedly renewed it became harder to reproduce. For nearly 3 millennia, Conquest failed to erase Egypt because conquerors usually ruled through what already existed. They could replace dynasties, demand tribute, settle foreign communities, and alter external loyalties. Yet the Nile Valley still required local knowledge, administrative practice, temple authority, and familiar ideas of kingship. Egypt survived foreign rule by making its conquerors enter an older political world. The crown changed hands many times, but the language of rule remained stubbornly Egyptian. By the time the old temple system finally began to fade, Egypt had already survived more than any single explanation can account for. It had endured weak kings, divided capitals, foreign dynasties, failed harvests, political conspiracies, collapsing trade networks, military defeats, religious change, and the loss of empire. It had been reunited after fragmentation, reorganized after conquest, and repeatedly reshaped by people whose ancestors had come from beyond its borders. Its longevity did not come from avoiding history. It came from absorbing history without allowing every crisis to destroy every layer of society at once. The river was the foundation, but the river alone was not enough. Other societies possessed fertile landscapes and still collapsed. The Nile concentrated population, agriculture, and movement within a long connected corridor, making it possible to transport grain, officials, troops, and ideas with unusual efficiency. It gave rulers a practical path toward reunification after division. Yet floods failed, channels shifted, harbours silted, and communities had to adjust continuously. Geography created opportunity. Human organisation turned that opportunity into endurance. The deserts and cataracts offered protection, but they did not make Egypt unconquerable. Armies crossed Sinai. Nubian kingdoms moved north. Libyan groups settled in the delta. Assyrians, Persians, Macedonians, and Romans reached the heart of the country. Natural defences slowed danger and narrowed the routes through which it approached, giving Egyptian rulers time and strategic depth. But those advantages mattered only when forts were staffed, roads maintained, intelligence gathered, and supplies moved. Administration provided another layer. Egypt learned very early to record people, land, goods, labour, and obligation. Writing gave institutions memory beyond the lives of individual officials. Scribes could preserve procedures, calculate rations, document ownership, and connect distant districts to courts, temples, and estates. The system was never perfectly centralized. Records could be manipulated, taxes could be oppressive, and local interests frequently resisted royal control. Yet the habit of governing through documents made power easier to reconstruct after a dynasty failed. Granaries and redistribution converted harvests into time. Stored grain could sustain workers, armies, temples, and towns beyond the immediate agricultural season. Local reserves, temple estates, and household networks created multiple points of survival. These systems did not prevent famine, and they often reinforced inequality. But they reduced the chance that one poor year or one broken institution would erase the entire social order. Below the state stood communities whose resilience was even more important. Farmers continued to understand the land when capitals changed. Craftspeople preserved techniques when royal workshops declined. Boat crews knew the river's shifting channels. Families transmitted property, obligations, and skills. Priests maintained rituals. Local officials continued to settle disputes and manage resources. A king could lose authority over Egypt without every village losing the knowledge required to remain alive. This distribute capacity explains why collapse so often remained partial. The Old Kingdom fell, but provincial networks survived. The Middle Kingdom weakened, but the Eastern Delta remained active enough for a new political centre to rise. The New Kingdom lost its empire, but the Nile heartland continued. Foreign rulers seized the crown, yet temple communities and administrators carried on. Egypt repeatedly lost the outer form of power, while preserving enough of the inner structure to build another form. Cultural memory made rebuilding possible. The image of the two lands, the double crown, Ma'at divine kingship, temple ritual, royal titulary, and stories of earlier rulers created a political vocabulary that could be reused for centuries. After crisis, a new dynasty did not need to invent legitimacy from nothing. It could announce that order had returned. It could rebuild a temple, revive an ancient title, copy an older text, or claim descent from an admired age. This did not mean the past was preserved accurately. Egyptian rulers selected, edited, and sometimes invented tradition. They erased rivals, revised king lists, reused monuments, and presented political innovation as ancient restoration. Yet even manipulated memory can stabilize a society when enough people understand its symbols. The past became a shared language through which change could be made familiar. Adaptability may have been the most important mechanism of all. Egypt absorbed foreign weapons after the Hyksos period, participated in international diplomacy during the New Kingdom, employed Nubian, Libyan, Aegean, and Southwest Asian soldiers, and accepted rulers whose origins lay far beyond the old royal houses. It borrowed without dissolving. New gods could enter the religious world. New scripts and economic practices could develop. Capitals could shift from Memphis to Thebes, from Ichtawi to Pyramises, from Tanis to Sais, and eventually to Alexandria. The centre moved, but the idea of Egypt remained. That adaptability had limits. Some crises brought long hardship. Some restorations benefited elites more than ordinary communities. The civilization's survival did not protect every person who lived within it. Farmers still faced taxation and shortage. Workers endured delayed payments. Political struggles brought violence and displacement. Foreign conquest could be harsh. Resilience should never be confused with comfort. Nor should Egypt be treated as uniquely timeless, while neighbouring societies are dismissed as failures. The Hittite Empire vanished, but communities of Anatolia continued. Mycenaean palaces fell, but Greek society transformed rather than disappearing. Cities in the Levant were rebuilt, abandoned, or reorganized in different ways. Every civilization leaves continuities beneath political rupture. Egypt stands out because its central symbols, writing traditions, temples, and forms of kingship remained recognizable across an exceptionally long period. Its endurance was therefore a matter of degree and pattern. Too many parts survived each crisis for history to start over completely. The river valley retained population, local networks retained knowledge, temples retained ritual authority, scribes retained administrative memory, new rulers retained the old crowns. Even when these elements changed, they remained connected strongly enough to make the next restoration possible. Eventually that chain weakened. Under Roman rule, Egypt remained wealthy and culturally alive, but its political centre had moved permanently beyond the Nile Valley. The emperor could appear on temple walls as a pharaoh, yet the older relationship between resident kingship, temple patronage, and Egyptian administration was changing. Over centuries, temples lost resources, priestly communities contracted, and hieroglyphic knowledge narrowed to fewer specialists. The final hieroglyphic inscriptions were carved in a world already transforming beyond recognition. The old signs still named gods, offerings, and rulers, but the institutions teaching people how to read them were disappearing. Christianity spread. New languages and religious communities reshaped the country. Temples closed or were repurposed. The civilization that had repeatedly restored itself could no longer reproduce all the systems that made restoration possible. Even this ending was gradual. Egyptian language survived in Coptic. Agricultural communities continued along the Nile. Towns remained occupied. Customs, stories, artistic forms, and sacred places entered new cultural worlds. Ancient Egypt did not vanish from the land. What ended was the long political and religious system that had allowed later rulers to stand beneath the old crowns and claim that nothing essential had changed. For nearly 3,000 years, that claim had been one of the most powerful tools of survival ever created. Egypt changed constantly while presenting itself as eternal. Its rulers understood that people could accept innovation more easily when it arrived dressed as restoration. Its institutions understood that continuity did not require perfect central control. Its communities understood how to continue when royal promises failed. The secret of Egyptian longevity was not immortality, it was recoverability. A dynasty might disappear from the king lists, a capital might lose its river channel, a temple might fall into silence, an empire might retreat from distant frontiers until little remained beyond the Nile. Yet somewhere in the valley, grain was still being measured, a legal claim was still being written, a festival route was still remembered, and an older royal name was still visible on stone. Enough pieces remained for someone to gather them and announce that order had returned. And now, after so many cycles of rising and falling, the monuments remain beneath a quieter sky. The river continues northward, passing fields whose boundaries have changed thousands of times. Desert wind moves across abandoned roads once used by quarry expeditions. Soldiers, priests, and merchants at Memphis, Thebes, Abydos, and the scattered capitals of forgotten dynasties. Broken walls preserve only fragments of the institutions that once seemed permanent. The rulers are gone. The scribes who counted their grain are gone. The workers who raised their temples, the boatmen who carried stone, and the families who watch new dynasties arrive have disappeared into generations too numerous to name. Most left no monument of their own, yet their repeated acts of maintenance gave the civilization its extraordinary length. They planted after poor floods, they repaired channels, they copied older words, they taught hands how to shape wood, stone, clay, and metal. They continued because life required continuation, even when history appeared to be ending. Perhaps that is why Egypt still feels different from a vanished kingdom. Its ruins do not belong to one lost moment. They belong to thousands of years in which endings were repeatedly mistaken for pauses. Each generation inherited structures damaged by the last and altered them just enough to keep them useful. No restoration returned Egypt to precisely what it had been, but each carried forward something recognizable. The Nile's water passing the ruins today is not the same water that reflected the pyramids when their casing stones were new. The channel itself has shifted, cities have moved, languages changed, and gods fallen silent. Still, the river remains a fitting final image for the civilization that grew beside it. It endured not by remaining still, but by continuing through change. In the darkness beyond the last temple inscription, the old Egypt finally becomes memory. Yet even memory travels. It passes through stories, excavated fragments, copied signs, and the quiet outline of monuments against the horizon. The kingdom could no longer return, but the idea of return survived, and beside the river, where order had been rebuilt so many times, the stones keep waiting beneath the desert light.